Today we're going to talk about three different movements that are fairly closely related, particularly the last two, minimalism and post-minimalism. But first we're going to talk about op art. If you haven't watched the presentation yet on abstract expressionism, you might watch that first. I think there's some pretty clear relationship between where I leave off with abstract expressionism, particularly with hard edge painting like Stella's work, and then come into op art. Okay, so first let's talk a little bit about what op art is and where it gets its start. So if you think back to my lecture on the Bauhaus and you remember how they offered like a wide barrage of different classes, some kind of traditional, some experimental, some with things we more associate with craft. One of the classes that they offered was taught by a guy named László Moholy-Nagy, and it utilized photography techniques as well as more remedial lessons like poking holes in a card and then moving them over images to create effects. And that class was called Optical Art and was about the creation of optical art and ways to create art that interacts with the way optics of our eyes work and creating these kind of trippy illusionistic type works. So from Bauhaus, as well as DaDa, Constructivism, Cubism, these are all influences, we get the emergence of this new form and movement called op art, which is short for optical art. Okay? The term op art is coined by Time magazine. It's in response to Julian Stanczak's exhibition, which is called Optical Paintings. It debuted in 1964 at Martha Jackson Gallery. And in basic terms, it's a form of abstract art, specifically non-objective art, so it doesn't have any relationship to a portrayal of an object, and it uses optical illusions. There are works that are retroactively kind of described as op art that were made earlier than 1964, but 1964 is the first time we see the actual term. The most famous artist associated with this movement, and the only one we're going to talk about in our brief exploration of it, is Bridget Riley. If you're going to talk about one person from op art, she is the person. So let's talk about her a little bit. She's born in 1931. She's still alive. Oh my goodness, another artist who is still alive. We've made it to this point in the semester. She's 89 years old. She lives in London. She also has a studio in France, so she kind of splits her time. So she has after her name a couple of letters. She has CH and then she has CBE. When you see a British person who has these letters after their name, those are very highly distinguished honors that are awarded by the Queen, or if there's a king at the time, whomever is the person leading the monarchy at the time. But they're kind of a big deal, so I'm going to explain to you what they are. So the CH is the Order of Companions of Honor. So the CH stands for Companions of Honor. She was awarded this in 1998, and she is only one of 65 people ever to have this honor. So it's a really, really big deal. And I don't know the exact number, but I think not many of them are women. Okay, so it's a British distinction for outstanding achievements, and that can be anything cultural, scientific, anything like that. The CBE stands for the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. It's an order of chivalry, which rewards contributions to the arts and to sciences. So those are kind of big deals for an artist to have. So she's extremely well regarded in her home country of Britain. She's also won lots of other important awards. In 1968, she won the International Painting Prize at the Venice Biennale, which is a huge deal. She, in 2012, was the first woman to win the Sikkens Prize, which is a Dutch prize that is awarded to people for their use and understanding of color. Another artist we'll look at today, Donald Judd, actually won that award at one point. Okay, so let's talk about her a little bit. She went to Goldsmith College, and then she went to the Royal College of Art. She graduated in 1955 from the Royal College of Art with her master's degree. She then works in advertising until about 1962. She was influenced by Jackson Pollock's work, which she first saw at the Whitechapel Gallery in 1958. The Whitechapel Gallery is a really important institution in terms of the history of art in Britain, and they have wonderful publication series affiliated with them. So if you're interested in art, Whitechapel Gallery is a gallery to have on your radar. She was also very interested in George Serra. Remember George Serra? He's the guy who he coined the term for his work divisionism, but we know it better as pointillism, the guy who did the little blobs of color. He was a post-impressionist. So she was super interested in him and in his ideas about making work that, remember when we talked about him and I talked about how he was interested in painting that was kind of completed in the optics, completed in the eye of the viewer? Bridget Riley thinks that's fascinating. She thinks it's a really good idea, and she thinks it's kind of strange that no one has pushed that any further or explored it further. So that's what she really becomes interested in, is kind of picking up ideas from pointillism, but applying them in a way that they affect the perception in the eye even further. If you're looking at this image, you can see what it kind of does with your eye, right? It looks like it moves. It's kind of vibrating. It's kind of hard to look at. So she gets set on that path by studying George Serra, and she achieves much more optically stimulating work than he did. She kind of goes in a different direction. Okay, lost my place. In 1962, she has her first solo show at Gallery 1 in London. She's interested in work that engages the viewer in a participatory way. So at this time in the 60s, and we'll talk about this briefly in contemporary art when I talk about installation art, which kind of gets, installation art and performance art both kind of have a lineage in things called happenings. So happenings are happening in the 1960s, and the idea is that they're these seemingly spontaneous, participatory, performative art happenings, things that just sort of happen on the spot, and often incorporate action and participation from the audience. So that's going on at this time, and that influences her. She's like, well, how can I do something that's participatory but is a painting? So it's drawing people in and making the viewer participate kind of more passively, basically. So with that and looking at Serra, she comes up with the idea for what we now know as optical art, basically. She's also interested in notions of mind and body duality. She's a big fan of the author Aldous Huxley, which if you've heard of him, you've probably heard of Brave New World. I don't know if do they still make people read that in high school? Well, anyway, he's an author. He is most famous for his novel Brave New World, but he also wrote about ideas about mind-body duality. He also took a lot of hallucinogens and wrote about it. So he, at this time in the 60s, was very interested in the way we perceive things and how that can be affected, and what the difference is between things that we are able to perceive in our mind and things that we perceive in the real world. So she also is kind of influenced by Huxley's investigations of hallucinogens and how that affects optical observation and response. So she has all these things that are kind of coming in, and she's trying to figure out how to translate that into painting. Okay, so she starts working, she does a bunch of black and white work, which is what she's most known for, and then she starts working in color in 1967. So let's just look at a couple of these, okay? So there's this one, Fission. We also have this one, which, see how long you can look at that. It makes me blink a lot. You might notice I'm having to like blink and reset my contact lenses. This is Fall. This is in 1963. And you'll notice she's painting these on board. They're not on canvas. So they're very, very flat and hard so that she can make these really precise lines. And this is polyvinyl acetate paint. It's kind of a precursor to acrylic paint, basically, on hardboard. And then here's just some examples of some of the work she does later in color, which also create optical effects and are pretty trippy. And if you see these in a museum, most museums that have a modern wing have at least one Bridget Riley. She's very prolific. And when you walk by these, they move with you. The experience is a little more dizzying in person, and some people even say they make them feel kind of car sick. So they're pretty incredible when you think about this. This is pre-computer. She's doing all this by hand. Pretty amazing stuff. So that's a very brief look at op art, but you kind of get the idea, right? Okay, now let's talk about minimalism. So minimalism in the visual arts, in music, in other mediums, in other media, minimalism is basically a movement that begins in post-World War II Western art. And it's most strongly associated with American visual arts in the 1960s and the early 1970s. Prominent artists are people like Agnes Martin, Carmen Herrera, Donald Judd, Robert Ryman, Isamu Noguchi, Tony Smith, Dan Flavin, lots of minimalists. So we're going to look at a few of them. Basically, I start here with Carmen Herrera. And I think she's a good, I start with her because I think she's a good bridge between op art and minimalism. Basically, you can see just by looking at this piece that it has kind of a vibe of op art. She's actually making work before op art was a thing. If you look at the date on this, it's 1952. But it could kind of, you could sort of categorize some of her early work in with op art. It has some of the same ideas and effects. She's born in 1915, and she is still alive. She's 105 years old, and she is still around, which is kind of amazing. So happy birthday, Carmen Herrera. You are over a 100-year-old lady still kicking ass in the arts. She's a Cuban American. She's born in Havana, Cuba. She's lived in New York pretty consistently since the 1950s. So when she's born in Havana, her father is the editor and founder of a newspaper. Her mother is a reporter for that newspaper. So her parents are educated. They're pretty supportive of ideas about education. She begins art lessons at a very young age. She takes private art lessons that her parents arrange for her. She then goes to Marymount School in Paris at the age of 14. So this is kind of an art-centric fancy high school, basically. She then goes to Universidad de La Habana to study architecture for college, and she drops out after a year. The reason she says she drops out is because there were all these protests and there were revolts and there were all these things happening that were very disruptive to her studies, and she didn't really feel like she was getting anything out of it. So she drops out. But it is at this time, even though she only spends a year in architectural school, that she becomes really inspired and interested in straight lines, which sounds overly simple, but she sort of sees straight line not just in an architectural sense, but she starts to see the potential that something as simple as straight lines have for artistic expressive purposes. Okay. Sorry, I have terrible allergies. I'm super sniffly. Okay, so then she studies at the Art Students League after moving to New York in the 1940s. She then moves to Paris in 1948. And this is when she starts to refine her hard-edge, non-objective style and starts really kind of getting into what can be done just with the line. And that's really her main focus. She moves back to New York from Paris in 1953. She becomes interested in her words, the physical structure of painting becoming an object. At this time, she's very close with Barrett Newman and Mark Rothko, who we talked about last time, and you can kind of see a relationship, how particularly Barrett Newman with his zips, his vertical lines that divide his color field paintings, how that would be of interest to her, and they would probably have a lot to talk about. She's very recently been kind of rediscovered. She had a retrospective in 2017 at the Whitney. She's a woman who was not recognized for her contributions to modern art until much, much, much later in life. So I'm glad she's finally getting some respect and acclaim, because she was quite important and was right in there with all the guys doing this work at the time. And you can also watch a documentary about her on Netflix. It's called The 100 Years Show. Okay, let's look at somebody else. So this is the artist I most associate with minimalism, which he would not like because he does not like that association, but that is too bad. This is Donald Judd. He is born in 1924. He dies in 1994. He's actually from Missouri. He was actually born in Missouri. He was born in a little town called Excelsior Springs. So if you've ever been to Excelsior Springs, that is the birthplace of Donald Judd. He disavows the term minimalism, which is too bad because he's sort of the poster boy for minimalism. I'm not alone in being the person that when you say minimalism, it's like, oh, Donald Judd. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, let's talk about what he did with his life a little bit. He had an undergraduate degree in philosophy from Columbia. He then does his master's also at Columbia in art history. He also went to classes at the Art Students League in New York, as have many of the people we've been talking about in modernism that were American. So that was kind of an important educational spot for a lot of the artists who contribute to the direction of modernism. There was a lot of influence there. So with this background in philosophy and art history, he's able to support himself by writing. He writes a lot of criticism, he writes for a wide variety of publications, and he is first predominantly known as a writer. He started, in terms of his studio work, he started as an expressionist painter, which is kind of interesting. I haven't actually seen any of his expressionist paintings. I don't know if they still exist, but I would love to see those. And then he got into woodcuts and printmaking from woodcuts. And then he becomes a sculptor, which is what he's definitely known most for now. His work centers on constructions in materiality and on precise straight lines and angles, which is very important to minimalist sculpture. When we think about minimalist sculpture, the materiality is very important, and generally we think about straight edges, rectilinear shapes, geometry. He wrote about his work as specific objects, and he actually writes an essay titled Specific Objects that is published in 1964. He also wrote a lot about the objecthood of his sculptures, and that is a common phrase from this time, from particularly minimalists, but the objecthood of things is something that you hear quite a lot. He developed a vocabulary for the forms he used in his work. He made his first floor box, which were these kind of cubes that just sit on the floor, and he made his first sculpture like that in 1964. Then later that year, he begins making work like this piece that I have a slide of here, which are the wall-mounted sculptures that are in a procession, are in a series. In 1986, he buys 340 acres outside of Marfa, Texas, to create the Chanati Foundation and the Marfa Artist Residency, which is pretty famous. A lot of big contemporary people have done residencies there and have worked there. It has a permanent collection of work, including work by Donald Judd, work by Dan Flavin, a bunch of the big minimalist guys of the time. And also, if you read Chris Krause's book, I Love Dick, or watch the HBO series, I Love Dick, the character Dick is partially based on Donald Judd. He's also largely based on Dick Hebdige, who's a sociologist, but that character, especially in the HBO series, is a very Donald Judd-esque kind of dude. Okay, so he's very important in the work that he does because it sort of defines the minimalist aesthetic, okay? And he's also very important as a writer because he writes down all these ideas about what minimalist art is about. Even though he doesn't like the phrase minimalist art, he's talking about work that is form-centric, so it's definitely a formalist kind of movement, and he is writing about objecthood. And these are things that are staples of minimalism and of minimalist sculpture. Okay, let's look at somebody else. Another guy from this time is Tony Smith. He's born in 1912. He dies in 1980. He created simple volumetric sculptures like this one. He was also interested in making work about objects and objecthood, and most of his work looks like this. He does what Donald Judd would call floor cubes, and he makes them out of various materials. This particular one is out of oxidized steel, which kind of looks forward to stuff that Richard Serra does later. I like to give this as an example because it is a very cut and dry example. If someone asks you to say, what is a minimalist sculpture? Tony Smith's Die, very direct minimalist sculpture. And I like to contrast it with the piece we're going to look at in post-minimalism. Okay, minimalism also involves painting. We looked at Carmen Herrera already. But one of the other most famous painters from this time is Agnes Martin. If we look back, so let's look at Tony Smith a little more. If we look at this and we think about minimalist sculptors, what they're doing is really reducing the experience of sculpture to its most fundamental level. So this kind of the idea is to control the audience and their experience a little bit, right? So this keeps the audience, in theory, from drawing on assumptions or on preconceptions about what sculpture is. It's very reductive. It reduces everything down to just a simple geometric shape. This is a cube. Okay, Agnes Martin does that with painting. She's born in 1912. She dies in 2004. She's a fascinating person. She was born to farmers in Saskatchewan in Canada, very remote. She moved to the US in 1931. She did undergrad at the Teachers College at Columbia. In 1947, she goes to the Summerfield School of the University of New Mexico in Taos. She moves to New York City in 1957. She leaves New York and the art world to live alone in Galisteo, New Mexico, in an adobe home she builds for herself that does not have running water or electricity. And she lives there pretty much for the rest of her life. I think the last couple years of her life, she goes into a retirement assisted living type facility, but she basically lives out in the middle of nowhere in an adobe hut she makes for herself. So she just totally becomes a hermit and goes away from the world. Barnett Newman actively promoted her work in New York, as did her friend and mentor, Ad Reinhardt. So Ad Reinhardt is another minimalist painter, and of course we've looked at Barnett Newman. So they're friends of hers and very important in her life. Reinhardt dies around the time that she and her girlfriend artist, Chrissa, she just used one kind of like Cher, Chrissa is Chryssa. So they've been together for a long time. They break up, then her friend Reinhardt dies, and that's when she leaves and decides to go live in an adobe hut in the middle of nowhere by herself forever. So there were a few factors that contributed. It's not known completely exactly why she left the world, but you know, one of your best friends and mentors dying and your longtime girlfriend breaking up with you. And they were also going to tear down the building that she'd been living and working in forever in New York, and she was just kind of fed up with New York. So she leaves. Okay, when she dies at the age of 92, she said she had not read a newspaper for over 50 years, which sounds kind of awesome to me right now. If you're ever in San Francisco, I lived in the Bay Area for a while, and the SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, has this room, and it's this octagonal small room that you can go in and you can sit on a bench in the middle of it, and you're totally surrounded by Agnes Martin paintings. And it was maybe my favorite place in San Francisco. I went there a lot. It's very meditative, it's very calming, you just go and sit, and it's a very good place to be. So if you're in San Francisco and you go to the SF MoMA, go to the Agnes Martin room. So basically, what Judd and Smith did for sculpture, Martin does for painting. She reduces everything down, right? She praised Mark Rothko as, in her words, having reached zero so that nothing could get in the way of truth. And I think that praise for Rothko is something that's sort of self-reflective in terms of her goals as an artist. She really wanted to pare her paintings down to the most reductive elements in a quest for truth. And so that is Agnes Martin. Another artist that I think you have to talk about when you talk about minimalism is Dan Flavin. Dan Flavin was Donald Judd's BFF. Judd named his son after him. Flavin Judd is a dude who still exists. He runs, I forget if it's a museum or an arts institution, something in New York named for his dad. Anyway, Dan Flavin and Donald Judd, very good friends. Dan Flavin is born in 1933. He dies in 1996. He's born in Jamaica. He comes to the United States and he comes to New York City in 1947. He was actually in New York City to go to seminary school. He was studying to become a priest. He's from a Catholic family. He drops out of the seminary and joins the Air Force. He returns to New York City in 1956. He briefly goes to the Hans Hofmann School of Fine Arts. He then goes to Columbia, where he studies painting and drawing. He also worked as a mailroom clerk at the Guggenheim, and through that job at the Guggenheim, even though he was just like in the mailroom, he meets a lot of important artists and critics that are working at the time and kind of gets a foot in the door of the art world. He started as an abstract expressionist painter. Again, I'm not familiar with his early paintings. I think they'd probably be pretty interesting to see. In the late 50s, he began making assemblage sculptures from found objects. So like finding things, even like aluminum cans and things on the street and putting them together, and then he'd kind of like create sculptures out of them. In 1961, while he was working as a security guard at the Natural History Museum in New York. And while he's there, he starts sketching and writing out ideas for sculptures that involve electronic lights. And that's really where he has his breakthrough and makes a name for himself. So in all of his work, he uses fluorescent lights to explore color, light, and sculptural space. In a lot of his early ones, he's just using white light like this, but he has other works where he uses different kinds of color of bulbs together, separate, monochromatic. His works are pretty incredible. He's another artist where you really have to experience these things to kind of get why they're interesting, in my opinion. But if you go back and put yourself in the time period where these things are being made, I mean, there's so many different kinds of art now. We see so much light art. We see all kinds of different installation and video and projection. This is brand new. Nobody's doing anything like this. This is a very good, very new, very original kind of shattering idea. And it's so lovely because it's so simple. It's such a simple concept. It's one of those things that I wish like I had a time machine and would have thought of this. My professor who I took the history of modern art with he kind of lived a lot of modern art. And I remember when he got to Dan Flavin and was talking about this, he was like, I saw this and I just thought, damn it, I wish I would have thought of this. Because it's simple, but it's so elegant and interesting. And it's really a way at looking at space by utilizing light. And so it's looking at space in a totally different way than anything up to this point has done. And it's pretty radical. It's a pretty impactful kind of work. Okay. So Isamu Noguchi, he's one of these artists that could go in a couple of different camps. I put him in minimalism, but he could easily be put in post-minimalism. He's a very interesting artist. He's born in 1904. He dies in 1988. He's born in Los Angeles. One of his parents is a Japanese poet, and the other is an American writer. And I think it's his dad is a Japanese poet, and his mom is an American novelist or something. I can't remember. Anyway, he's born in LA, but they moved to Japan, and he spends a lot of his childhood in Japan before coming back to the States. In 1926, he wins a Guggenheim Fellowship. So he is, with that, able to go and study sculpture in Paris, and he studies with Constantine Brancusi. He's an assistant in Brancusi's studio. So you remember when we talked about Brancusi, one of my favorite guys of all time. And you can kind of see the influence of Brancusi on his work, I think. This work, Shodoshima Stone Study. Shodoshima in Japanese means magical island, and it is the name of an island off the coast of Japan. The reason the sculpture is called this is because that is the island where this granite comes from. So when we talk about minimalism and really modern art, and we talk about the importance of materiality and the awareness of one's materials, and what that means to what you're making and creating, naming the piece after the stone you're making it from is kind of a meta way of making the materiality of the work prominent to the piece, right? So you're naming the piece after what it is it's made out of, and that kind of shows that the materiality of the work is the primary concern, which is a very minimalist idea. Now, the way he treats the stone in the sculpture is a little more leaning towards post-minimalism, and the reason for that is we don't see our sharp angles, we don't see the rectilinear kind of control on this. Instead, he's looking at curvilinear type works. He's looking at this heritage of Japanese Zen gardens and rock gardens. He's making these kind of egg-like shapes that are in this opening, so it has like ideas about birth maybe. And we see kind of the broken, rougher edge of the outer pieces of the granite, and then the very controlled kind of machine cut inner lines of the granite. So some of those ideas fit a little bit more in with post-minimalism, but in terms of the awareness of materiality, he's kind of a guy you could put in either camp. So I put him here as kind of our bridge person going into post-minimalism. Okay, so post-minimalism, in visual art, post-minimalism, basically it uses minimalism as either an aesthetic or conceptual reference point. So when you see a movement that's post something else, that means that the something else is important to the identity of this movement. So it's using minimalism as a reference point to kind of push off against. Post-minimalism is more an artistic tendency than a particular movement, in that it's hard to define. It wasn't like a collective movement with a manifesto. Post-minimalist artworks are usually everyday objects, or they use simple materials. Sometimes they take on kind of a pure formalist aesthetic. But since post-minimalism includes such a diverse and disparate group of artists, it's impossible to enumerate all the different similarities between all of the artists. It's kind of it's a mixed bag, basically. In 1966, there's a New York exhibition called Eccentric Abstraction. It's put together by critic Lucy Lippard. Lucy Lippard curates the works, and it's a group of artists including Ava House, Louise Bourgeois, and Bruce Nauman. The pieces in it often combined unusual and soft, pliable materials. Some borrowed ideas from minimalism, like the modular, repetitive composition, and some of them also were kind of more relaxed and interested in open structures. That exhibition, in my mind, marks the beginning of post-minimalism and is kind of a good grouping to get some of the theory and the ideas behind what post-minimalist means. So again, that's Eccentric Abstraction is the exhibition that I would check out. Major artists associated with this movement, we have Ava Hess, we have Louise Bourgeois, we have Louise Nevelson, we have Richard Serra. Lots of people could fit into this category. Okay, so first, we're going to look at Ava Hess, and we're going to talk about her a lot, because if you're going to pick one artist to talk about with post-minimalism, it's Ava Hess. She's born in 1936. She dies in 1970. She's born in Hamburg, Germany. She and her family flee the Nazis in 1938. 1938. Eventually, they land in New York in 1939. She and her sister first are sent off by their parents by themselves. They're very, very young. They're sent to the Netherlands, and then from there they kind of regroup, and all of them eventually make it to New York as a family. Her parents separate in 1945, and then her mother dies by suicide in 1946. She has a lot of marked trauma early in her life that impacts her work and her perspective. She herself dies very tragically. She has a brain tumor, and she dies of a brain tumor in 1970 when she was quite young, which is terrible because she was so prolific and made so much important work in her brief working career that if she would have been around longer, it would have been incredible to see what she did. But she's a very important artist, one of the most important sculptors in the 20th century. Okay, so let's learn a little about her life. She graduated from the New York School of Industrial Art at the age of 16. She then goes to Pratt School of Design. She drops out after only, I think, a year, maybe 2 years. She then takes classes at the Art Students League. She takes a couple of classes at Cooper Union, which I've mentioned several people we've studied go there. She then goes to Yale, where she graduates in 1959. So a very smart, very ambitious, accomplished student. I mean, you know, it's hard to go to Yale. Okay. After Yale, she returns to New York City, where she kind of starts hanging out with a group of artists like Saul LeWitt. He's another person sort of associated with minimalism, also installation work. She's hanging out with Donald Judd. She's hanging out with Yayoi Kusama. We'll talk about Kusama when we talk about installation art. So she's kind of in the mix with minimalist sculptors and artists of the time. She marries sculptor Tom Doyle. They moved to Germany in 1965 because he has a residency there. A residency, when you're an artist, you can apply for residencies that are of different lengths, where you go to a place and they give you a studio and somewhere to live, and your job is just to make art there. I've done a couple of them. They're pretty rad. If you're an artist, after you graduate, I recommend checking out artist residencies. Okay, so they go to Germany for Tom's residency. She hated it there. She hated Germany. This marks the beginning of the end of their marriage, but it is an important step for her in her career, because when they're living there, they're living in an abandoned textile mill, so this very industrial space, and they're using it as a place they live, and also it's their studio space. And so while she's there, she starts drawing all these different machine parts, and then she starts experimenting with a kind of assemblage type work. She makes her first relief sculpture at this time, where she uses a covered electrical cord and coils it, and then she covers it in paint. It's called Ring Around the Rosie, and that is kind of a aha moment, a breakthrough moment for her in terms of her career. So it is important that she takes this trip to Germany. Another big breakthrough point is in 1967, she starts using latex, and she uses it in totally new ways that have not been seen in the art world or anywhere. Latex is originally developed for casting, so you would make a mold and fill it with latex, and then you pop the mold off and you have a shape. She uses it more like with a paintbrush. She paints out layers of it and layers it up and then peels it up, and it makes this stuff that looks sort of like crackled paper a little bit. So she's using materials that exist in ways they are not intended to be used, and that's kind of a hallmark of post-minimalism. So it has this primary means of attaining her artistic goal, which her stated main artistic goal, we have some interviews with her, and one of the things that she puts forth as her main goal in art is that she wants to produce an object that comes from a total other reference point. So she wants to make objects that don't look like anything else ever made. Okay, so her primary means of attaining that artistic goal was this. She had this extraordinary sensitivity. She had the sensitivity to diverse and often kind of weird, kind of untraditional materials, and that's what she worked. So she used paint in weird ways. She'd use paper mache. She used rope. She used nets. She used fiberglass. She used latex, but always in very strange, unexpected ways. And her control of material was also incredible. So she pushed a given medium, any of these media that she would use. She would take a medium and she would push it to its absolute limit. She would do this by repeating processes so often that it kind of became like obsessive. She'd do something over and over and over and over and over again to see how much the latex or whatever she was working with could take. But simultaneous to this obsessive kind of repetitive process work, she also kind of knew when to step back, right? She knew when to step back and kind of take direction and take cues from the medium. So that's one of the things when we think back on the last lecture and Helen Frankenthaler, the soak stain painter, how she talked about pouring the paint and how it was a partnership between her and the paint, how she's putting it on the canvas and she's manipulating it, but she also kind of lets it create the direction of the shapes that the work is going to take. Ava House kind of does that with sculpture. So she will control something and test it to see what all it's capable of. And then as she's working with it, if she sees it going in an interesting direction, she kind of lets it do its thing and then goes back and manipulates it. So it's this really interesting tension in her work between letting the media go and between her manipulation. So it's kind of it's basically her work blossoms and becomes its best it can be in this weird kind of liminal space that exists between control and freedom. So she's working in this area with these materials that have never been used in this way. So this work is titled Not Yet, Untitled or Not Yet. And here you can kind of see what I'm talking about. She's taking these bags, these found objects, which are these net bags, and then she takes metal weights and wraps them in paper and then wraps that in polyethylene sheeting, puts them in the bags, and lets the weights pull them into these shapes and tacks it to the wall. So when you think back to her stated goal of creating an object that has no reference here, that's kind of what she's doing when she's experimenting with these works. We're going to look at a few of her pieces. This is a piece from a series. Excuse me, this is a session 2, so she has a whole accession series that are these cubes. And the starting point I like to take with this work is to look at the definition of the word accession. So it has 2 different definitions. One is the attainment of a position of rank or power, and the other is a new item added to an existing collection of attributes. So when we think about this meaning, this dual meaning of this word that she has titled this series of pieces, and we think about, say, the relation of this work to Judd or Smith's work, right? Smith, who did the steel cube. She wrote about the struggles of being a woman artist, being a woman sculptor at this time, and how she had to work harder in her perception to get noticed and to get her work out there than she thought her male counterparts at the time did. So when you look at the word accession, which is about attaining a position of rank, so these works are kind of maybe a comment on trying to attain a position of rank within the arts community. It's also this idea of adding to an existing collection of artifacts. So she takes this fabricated form of the cube. Judd and Smith and these guys, by the way, are having these cubes, these things that they make. They design them and then they have them fabricated. They're made by other people. They don't make them, okay? This is a thing in the art world, and I'm not, like, no shame. That's fine. You design something, have someone fabricate it. So this, she has the outside, the exterior form, the cube, fabricated, but then she goes in and painstakingly threads all of these plastic tubes by hand. So it's this idea of adding something to the narrative of the cube. Cubes as artifacts in modern art, she's adding an artifact, ascension, but she's adding it with her interior dialogue that's being created here that challenges it, that is made out of something soft. So it's also this dichotomy between the soft tubes and the hard rectilinear galvanized steel on the outside. So we also have some ideas about gender, about femininity and masculinity here as well. And this is from a series, as I said, which has been widely discussed in terms of the opposition between the regular geometric minimal exterior and their more organic, hairy looking interiors, okay? Many critics critics talk about these being Hess's visual representation of her challenge to minimalism aesthetics from within. Like, she's working with these guys, she's hanging around all these minimalist sculptors at the time, so she's sort of an insider who's challenging some of their ideas, saying, I don't know if this rectilinear, like, prefabricated thing is the end-all be-all of sculpture and of expression. So she herself, her opinion on these changes. So she makes these, and then a couple years later, she's commenting back on them, and she says, so she deems them a little too precious. She says, at least from where I stand now, they're too right, they're too beautiful. I'd like a little more wrong at this point. So even after she adds all this hairy interior with these tubes, she thinks it's too perfect. Okay, the fabrication is not something she's that interested in. She doesn't think that she thinks it's too precious and too kind of persnickety. So she says this just 2 years after making the piece. Okay, talk about this and then we'll talk about something else, I promise. Okay, so this is called Right After. This is a suspended filigree of fiberglass encased in translucent resin. So it's fiberglass that she's then dipping and encasing in a translucent resin. And it's this beautiful thing. Like, it looks like a luminous, like, calligraphy, like someone writing an Arabic calligraphy or something in the sky to me. And she kind of bemoans this one too. She's very self-critical. So she sort of bemoans the easy glamour of Right After. She just thinks it looks so easy when it's created, and it has this kind of glamorous edge. But she was also able to embrace the elegance of the medium. She said about this piece, if you use fiberglass, clear and thin, light does beautiful things to it. It is there. It's part of its anatomy. So, like the minimalists, she is very aware of the materiality of her works and is very conscious of what she's making them out of and how best to utilize that materiality, how best to utilize the material to work to its strengths and to do something new and incredible with it. And all of her hanging fiberglass works, and she has, I think, 4 or 5 that are sort of in this family of work. And they use the play of light to dispense perceptual information about their surrounding environments. And what I mean by that is she's very aware of how light affects these things. She's very aware of how they're going to cast shadow. She's very aware of how they're going to feel in a space. And she's utilizing the nature of the material of fiberglass to achieve this kind of look. So it's another thing, going back to this idea when I was talking about Rothko, of making something simple to communicate complex ideas. And I feel like Ava Hess does that extremely well and in an extremely unique way. Okay, let's talk about someone else, or I'll never shut up about Ava Hess. Louise Nevelson. Okay. Louise Nevelson, she's born in 1899. She dies in 1988. And she creates, most of her work looks like this. She, in different scales, sometimes they're white instead of black. Very occasionally, I think there's like 1 or 2 that are all red. But basically, she creates sculptures by she combines the sense of architectural fragments, kind of like a found piece of a building almost. So she takes these architectural fragments and she combines this with kind of almost like Duchamp's notion of found objects. So there's all these little found objects that she puts inside these sort of architectural looking frames. But then she paints them all in a monotone, which brings in this kind of minimalist palette and unites the whole assemblage and simplifies it in that way. When everything's the same flat color, it kind of brings everything together in a really arbitrary way. When talking about her work, Nevelson speaks a lot about the in-between. So she's interested in the in-between places, and she's interested in the transitional realm. I think her works are pretty great, and they take this rigid structure, kind of like Ascension. They're taking this rigid exterior structure that's associated with with minimalism that we associate with minimalism, but then she's filling them with these irregular kinds of objects and shapes, which seems a little bit more chaotic. It brings in the idea of the found object, but then she's bringing it back down to a more approachable and unified place by painting them all one color. Okay. The second to last person we're going to talk about today is Louise Bourgeois. The other Louise, but really the Louise Bourgeois is the Louise of art history and of my heart. She is born in 1911. She dies in 2010. Louise Bourgeois, she's sort of like Marcel Duchamp and Francis Picabia in that she dabbles in a lot of different movements. She could be put in with surrealism, she could be put in with minimalism, she could be put in a lot of different places. And she lives a very long life, and she continues making work and experimenting in her work throughout her entire life. She lives well into her 90s, and she makes work the whole time. So she experiments in terms of style, in terms of what media she uses for decades and decades. Basically, I keep going off on tangents and I lose my place in my notes. Anyway, I think she makes sense in post-minimalism. And for one reason, she's in that exhibition by Lucy Lepard, the Eccentric Abstraction show. She'd been making work for years and years before that, but she's one of the people who's included in that exhibition, and I think it kind of makes sense to put her here. Okay, so her work, it takes on a lot of different sort of flavors. It can be sensuous and organic. It can also be rigid and architectural. She makes a lot of installation work. We'll talk about installation and site-specific work in contemporary art, but she's someone who works in that area. She's also a painter. Her drawings are great. She's a printmaker. She does all different kinds of work. So where did she come from? Her parents owned a gallery in Paris. It was a gallery that dealt in antiques, particularly antique textiles, and she helped repair them starting at a very young age. In 1930, she goes to the Sorbonne, and there she studies mathematics. And she says of this, which I just think is funny given her history, she says, "I got peace of mind only through the study of rules that no one can change." So she says that's why she was studying mathematics instead of studying art, which is hilarious because she spends her entire career challenging and breaking all the rules that exist. So it's kind of funny to hear her use that as her rationale for why she liked mathematics and wanted to study mathematics. Okay. She begins to study art after her mother dies in 1932. She graduates in 1935, and then she enrolls in École des Beaux-Arts, which again is the famous art academy in Paris, where a lot of the Impressionists and a lot of people we've studied go. She marries an American art professor in 1938 and moves with him to New York. I think he taught at NYU. They're married until his death in 1973. When she moves to New York, she takes classes at the Art Students League. Again, this is very important. A lot of artists gain education through classes at the Art Students League at this time. In 1973, she starts teaching at Pratt and Cooper Union. She also teaches at the School of Visual Arts in New York from 1974 to 1977. And she makes work throughout her life. So this is a piece from the 60s. I'd say it's typical of Louise Bourgeois, but so are about a million different styles. But this is something that certainly looks like a lot of her work at this time. So we have this sort of sensual, organic, maybe figural, referential, but abstracted work that has this very smooth, it's carved from marble, it has this very smooth surface. And then she puts it on a plinth that's made from rough-hewn cut railroad ties. So it has this very rough, organic base with this sort of smooth, sensuous marble on top. So it creates this kind of tension and contrast between the two, which is the idea of contrast between materiality and between smooth and rough is something that we see in post-minimalism. Here is a work of hers that you can see very nearby if you drive down to Bentonville, Arkansas, and go to Crystal Bridges, which is a great museum. I recommend it. They purchased Maman, which is the French word for mother, which is one of a series of 9 Maman sculptures. These are gigantic steel spiders. It's 30 feet tall, so there are several of these works. They're incredible. I love her spider sculptures. She does a lot of variations on this in the 90s. And so that's a work of hers that you can see very nearby. Even though it's made much, much later, it's still in keeping with some of the ideas that come out of post-minimalism. I mean, if you look at the structure of the way she's treating steel in this organic way, it kind of goes back to some of the stuff that Ava House is doing, right? We see these kind of organic lines, but she's using them in this very rigid material and steel to create this kind of organic shape and feeling. It's a great sculpture. You can see it relatively nearby. Okay, the last person that we are going to talk about is Richard Serra. He was born in 1938. He's still alive. He's 81. And he's the only artist I can think of offhand whose work has actually killed some people. I think 3 people have died installing Richard Serra works. They're very big and very heavy. Not that that's exactly his fault, but random Richard Serra fact for you. Okay, so he's another person who could be put in minimalism or post-minimalism. I could see an argument either way. But his irregular shapes and the torqued ellipses, which become kind of the staple of his career later on, and we'll look at one of those, to me, put him more in the post-minimalism crowd, basically. He studied English literature at Berkeley. He then goes to Yale for his MFA, and he graduates in 1964. He then wins a scholarship to go study art in Paris. He does that. Then he wins a Fulbright to go study in Florence, and he does that. And since then, he has lived in New York City. He makes, so in 1966, he makes work that sort of looks like Ava House's work. So he sees this work and he starts also working with experimental material. He starts experimenting with rubber. So he made some work with rubber and fiberglass in the late 60s and is kind of experimenting in that post-minimalist vein. He also made a piece, and he recreated it a couple of times, where he takes molten lead, boiling, bubbling liquid lead, and takes a ladle and throws it, just flings this molten lead at a gallery wall, so it drips down and then ends up on the floor. There's one of these at the SF MoMA in San Francisco. I think there's one at the MoMA in New York, too. I'm not totally sure about that. But anyway, so he does this kind of performance piece that's also site-specific and has an intersection between sculpture. It also kind of has an intersection with painting because of the dripping. It also has this performative quality as like an artifact of performance. So that also, to me, makes him more in the post-minimalist camp. In 1969, he starts working with lead sheets, which is what this piece is made out of. Lead is not super stable. It collapses and curves over time, making this kind of a dangerous thing, especially the way that he first made these, which were called, he called the series of sculptures props. This one's called 1 ton prop. So we take these very heavy sheets and just lean them, and then the only thing holding them is the tension between the friction of them leaning and gravity. So he's also working not just with the metal as his medium, but also the laws of physics kind of are part of the sculpture. And so this interaction with his physical world becomes part of the work. And then in the 70s, he starts the work that he is best known for, and those are the large rolls and sheets of Cor-Ten steel, which is steel that is then oxidized so it rusts and has this beautiful rust patina to it. Okay, so we see works like this, which again, this is kind of a riff on the cube, right? So we have seen Ava House's riff on the minimalist cube, and now we see Serra's, which is kind of this deconstructed cube that's precarious. It's kind of not as sound and structural in minimalism, and this is reduced down. It creates this sort of precarity and sense of tension. And then his most famous works and the work he's most known for, as I said, are these Core 10 oxidized steel pieces, which the ones that are in this shape are called torqued ellipses as a group. This particular one is called Joe, and it is at the Pulitzer in St. Louis. So you can go up to St. Louis to the Pulitzer, which is a wonderful museum. It's a great building. It's a beautiful building. And on the roof, they have this Richard Serra, which was made for that space. You can walk inside these when you see his torqued ellipse pieces, and as you walk through them, the experience is incredible. First of all, the patina, the rusted metal, is very beautiful. It looks different at different times of the day. As you walk through, because of the way the walls kind of slant in and out and move as you walk through it, it changes your perception. It's a little bit dizzying almost, and it also cuts up the sky in different ways. So it changes your perception of your environment, which is very much a focus of all of Richard Serra's work, as it cuts space and changes the way that you experience space, which is a post-minimalist idea. Okay, so that is it for op art, minimalism, and post-minimalism. We'll finish up modernism in the next lecture, where I will talk about pop art. I hope you have a great rest of your day.